Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast, our first of 2025. You're listening to Helen Bennett, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and Dennis Hall, LLG's Bulletin Editor.
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to be with you, Helen.
Thank you, Dennis. Now that we've had a tremendous amount of announcements from the government in the run-up to the Christmas break, and the House returned on the 6th of January, and hasn't, it seems, slowed down in any way. So many things to talk about, Dennis. So what's your first topic?
Helen, my first topic concerns housing and planning. This was another big announcement by the government amidst the avalanche of pre-Christmas publications that we really need to look at. The UK has a housing crisis. Ministers want to build 1.5 million new homes by the end of the Parliament. And the only way to do this, the government argues, is to overhaul planning rules. Before Christmas, the government published an 82-page National Planning Policy Framework report outlining what it hopes to do and how. So, what does the report say? Well, essentially, it sets out the criteria that should be used to help turbocharge building by shaking up the planning rules. In debates in the House of Commons, the Housing Minister, Matthew Pennycook, recognised that some of the proposals would meet resistance from vested interests. But he said ministers were determined to push on. And the task is ambitious. Ministers require an average of 370,000 homes to be approved a year to meet demand. The last time more than 300,000 houses were built in a year was when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister in 1970. So who needs to do what and by when? The revised framework reintroduces mandatory targets for councils. Under a new standardised assessment of need, London is the only region that has a reduced requirement, with an annual target falling from 98,822 to 87,992. But all regions will need to deliver an annual housing approval uplift of above 20%, with the largest rise of 79% required in the northeast, followed by 61% in the northwest. And councils will have 12 weeks to ensure that their local plans are up to date and comply with the new framework. But here's one of the big questions. Will there be building on greenbelt land? The answer seems to be quite possibly. The new planning document says the government attaches great importance to greenbelts, which are there to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. And building on brownfield sites is still the priority. But, and it's a big but, given the scale of the challenge, that will not be enough. And some types of building on greenbelt land should be considered, the government says. The government goes on, a development which complies with its 5 golden rules should be given significant weight in favour of the grant of permission. So, here's the question, what are those golden rules? The new document says that the rules represent a set of requirements aimed at balancing the need for housing with the protection of greenbelt land. The rules are there, it says, to ensure that such development provides benefits to the community and mitigates potential negative impacts on the green belt. However, it goes on to say there are certain types of building that could be undertaken without breaking the rules. And specifically, this includes the provision of affordable housing, necessary improvements to local or national infrastructure, and the provision of new or improvements to existing green spaces that are accessible to the public. But not all of the homes built on greenbelt would have to be affordable housing. But the planning document says this has to be a priority. And it goes on that a 50% affordable housing contribution should apply by default if there is no pre-existing requirement. So what about so-called grey belt land? The government defines grey belt as land in the green belt comprising previously developed land, or land that does not strongly contribute to 3 of the 5 purposes of the green belt, namely checking urban sprawl, preventing the merging of neighbouring towns, and preserving the character of historic towns. The document doesn't say this explicitly, but it does seem to suggest that building in grey belt areas could be considered favourably. And the government says that this grey belt definition will allow for development on land that is not already previously developed, as we believe it is important that we consider the development potential of land which, though it may be formally designated as green belt, no longer adequately serves the green belt purposes. Interesting. Helen.
Yeah, this year is definitely going to see a lot of changes to the planning world, Dennis, but we'll pick up a bit more on that later. Now, in other news, audit has been the subject of much criticism these past 2 years, and in fact, I still do not think that audit is given the credit and importance it deserves in some councils. Now, the government, probably recognising issues over delay, let's not forget that last year only 1% of local bodies' audited accounts were published on time, and there were 918 outstanding audit opinions as of September 2023. So the government has launched a consultation entitled Local Audit Reform, a strategy for overhauling the local audit system in England. Now, no doubt our colleagues in SIPFA will be taking a look at this, but indeed audit plays a fundamental role in governance, and local authority lawyers need to be up on what's happening in this field. So what's the government looking at? What is it trying to achieve? Well, it wants to introduce a series of measures to fix what it calls the broken local audit system. And these include setting out a local audit vision with 8 core principles, the establishment of a statutory and independent local audit office with 5 strategic responsibilities, which are coordinating the system, contract management, ownership of the code of audit practice, quality oversight, and reporting, mandating audit committees. Now, just to be clear, this relates to England only, as it's a devolved matter. The consultation is long and it's detailed, so I can't possibly go all the way through it here, but for those of you who are thinking, this is a return to the Audit Commission, the government is stating strongly that it is not. Indeed, within the document, the government specifically state this is not a return to a bloated Audit Commission. Lessons will be learnt, and the LAO will be proportionate and operate within its strategic objectives and the principles of this strategy. It will be interesting to see how things develop and whether that will indeed prove to be the case, and it probably would make a very interesting discussion that we may well pick up later with a more varied panel, but that's certainly the stated intention. Incidentally, the timeline for the establishment of the local audit office is August 2026. Now, in terms of relationships with audit committees, the government's position is that existing relationships between local bodies and their auditor need to be strengthened, and their respective relationship with the LAO must be clear. And the collective scrutiny of audits as part of the democratic process, such as audit committees, will be strengthened, and the potential for local accounts committees for strategic authority areas in England will be considered. And audit regimes will be reviewed to ensure they are fit for purpose in the short and long term. To achieve its ambition for the audit regime, the government have picked up several themes from the Redmond Review. Listeners might remember back in 2020, when it was published, that Sir Tony Redmond undertook a comprehensive review of local authority financial reporting and external audit in England, with the aim at the time of addressing inefficiencies in the local audit system whilst enhancing accountability of local authorities to taxpayers. So, like I said, there's a lot to it. The consultation closes on the 29th of January, and we will follow what the government develops as it moves forward. Dennis.
Well, Helen, I turn next to the important new rules for planning committees. These involve a huge shift in local accountability and democratic control. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government unveiled before Christmas proposals to overhaul the role of planning committees, with changes that could see decisions bypass committees entirely if applications comply with local development plans. Announcing the changes, the Secretary of State for Local Government, Angela Rayner, said the reforms would help streamline the planning system and tackle what she described as chronic delays she claimed were plaguing the system. According to the policy paper published alongside Rayner's statement, the government is mulling 3 different proposals designed to facilitate faster delivery of homes. The main proposals which would require changes to primary legislation through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, include, first, a new national scheme of delegation bringing clarity and consistency to everyone about which applications get decided by officers and which by committees. Second, dedicated committees for strategic development, allowing a dedicated and small group of councillors to dedicate energy to the most significant projects. And finally, training for committee members to require that councillors undertake appropriate training before they can form part of a planning committee. Now, the policy paper sets out 3 potential options for a national scheme of delegation, all of which involve delegating decisions to planning officers to some extent. The first option would require decisions to be delegated to a planning officer where an application complies with the development plan. For instance, when the application is for development on an allocated site, in line with plan policies or in line with a design guide. The second option would involve delegation to a planning officer as default, with exceptions for departures from the development plan. Now, under this scheme, all applications must be delegated to officers unless the application is a departure from the development plan and is recommended by officers for approval, or where the application has been submitted by the local planning authority, its members or officers. Now, the third option would again require all applications to be delegated to officers. However, the national scheme of delegation would set out a prescriptive list of application types to be determined by committees to provide certainty to applicants from the start. The policy paper also detailed the proposals for dedicated committees on strategic development. The proposals would introduce a requirement that local authorities set up committees to focus on strategic development where such development is planned in their area. Such committees would take ownership of strategic development applications and build expertise using local knowledge and understanding of planning issues, the paper said. Now, these committees would operate in addition to the main planning committee and would focus only on those developments that are critical to supporting local economic development and local housing need, according to the paper. The government said it may take forward any or all of these proposals and that it will consult on any proposals that it decides to advance. Now, these changes represent an historic shift in the balance of power between the central government and local planning committees. They will be controversial. Arguably, they remove local democratic control over planning decisions in order that government can achieve a key policy goal. As they say, the end justifies the means. Helen.
Well, I think it will be contentious, Dennis, and we're calling all our planning lawyers to attend a roundtable. It's going to be held this Wednesday, 15th of January at 12 o'clock to discuss LLG's response to the government's working paper. If you are interested in attending to give your view, that would be absolutely marvellous, and you can find the information on our events page. And this is locked to LLG members, but you don't need to be a planning lawyer specifically. If you have some experience of planning committees, you are more than welcome to attend, because it's a very important area. We want to address some of the elements that are stated in the working paper. Now, more consultations are on the go, so to speak, and one of particular importance to LLG is that of strengthening the standards and conduct framework for local authorities, not least because we've been actively campaigning on this since 2019. The consultation closes on the 26th of February as it runs 10 weeks from the 18th of December, but LLG will not be leaving it to the 11th hour to respond. What we are doing to inform our response is surveying our membership, and members should receive a link this week to that, holding roundtables, speaking to our corporate partners, and of course Deborah and I are liaising with a number of stakeholders because we want to get this right and fit for purpose. So briefly, the government is proposing the following: the introduction of a mandatory minimum code of conduct, which would seek to ensure a higher minimum standard of consistency in setting out the behaviours expected of elected members. Mandated provision of standards committees rather than arrangements in place, and within that, whether the independent person and co-opted members should be given voting rights, and whether standards committees be chaired by the independent person, whether there should be a requirement to publish annually a list of allegations of code of conduct breaches and any investigation outcomes, continuing started investigations against councillors who stand down before determination, the power of suspension, interim suspension and views on length, also the power of disqualification, withholding allowances and premises and facilities ban. Now, the process of appeals, including a national appeals body, is also within the paper. Now, this latter point potentially, obviously to some, brings back concerns for a return to the old style system and the standards boards for England. But we are at very early days here, and where there are sanctions, there must surely follow a right of appeal. But what that looks like, of course, and what safeguards need to be in place, that's the detail that needs to be considered. We are looking for as much engagement as we can from our members. We want to hear from all levels of lawyers. So please do participate when the opportunity arises. Dennis.
Thank you. Well, now for something different. My final piece is on a curious employment case concerning comments about accents at work. In the case of Carozzi against the University of Hertfordshire, the Employment Appeal Tribunal reviewed the question of whether comments that an employee was subjected to regarding their accent could amount to harassment under the Equality Act 2010. The employee, who was employed by the respondent but resigned during her probationary period, brought several complaints, including constructive dismissal, race and religious discrimination, harassment and victimization. The Employment Tribunal considered 36 separate allegations, but the appeal just focused on three main aspects: harassment related to the claimant's accent, the dismissal of a victimization complaint, and alleged procedural bias by the tribunal. Now, the initial Employment Tribunal found that the comments about the employee's accent were not race-related harassment because they were not explicitly motivated by the employee's race. The EAT overturned the tribunal's decision on the claimant's harassment claim. It emphasized that conduct does not need to be explicitly motivated by a protected characteristic, such as race, in order to constitute harassment under the Equality Act. Instead, conduct may relate to a protected characteristic, such as comments about an accent linked to national or ethnic identity. The Appeal Tribunal clarified that while discriminatory intent is not required, harassment occurs where conduct is connected to a protected characteristic and either violates a person's dignity or creates an intimidating, hostile, degrading, or offensive environment. Now, in this case, the Appeal Tribunal found that comments about the claimant's accent could meet these criteria and remitted the claim to a differently constituted employment tribunal for reconsideration. Now, what are the learning points? Well, this case highlights the importance of maintaining an inclusive workplace and understanding the broad scope of harassment laws under the Equality Act. Comments about personal traits, such as an employee's accent, can constitute harassment if they relate to a protected characteristic, even without discriminatory intent. Employers should ensure their equality and diversity policies are comprehensive and communicated effectively to all staff. Regular training on respectful workplace interactions can help prevent unintended offences and foster a culture of inclusion. An unusual case this, perhaps, which might surprise some people, but nonetheless it provides clear advice on the very broad scope of our equality law. Helen.
Certainly does, Dennis. Now, finally from me, I want to talk about our new LLG Welsh Bulletin, specifically designed for our colleagues in Wales, which we will produce fortnightly throughout the year. This new resource is dedicated to the interests of LLG members in Wales and will look at Welsh legislation, Welsh local government news and the Welsh legal profession. And let's not forget, however, that those of you practicing in England can often learn a lot from the status of affairs in Wales, and therefore you might also want to cast your eye over it. As it's a new themed bulletin, as such, all feedback is much appreciated. So let us turn then to a topic within this new edition and given to us by virtue of North Wales Live, and the subject, camping. Now, during the pandemic, the restriction on how long a pop-up campsite could operate before planning permission was required was extended from 28 days to 56 days. However, in 2022, the provision reverted back to 28 days. But in England, the opposite occurred. Indeed, the UK government went a little further and extended its permitted development rights from 28 days to 60 days in July 2023. Now, since that time, there have been numerous calls for the Welsh Government to re-examine this, and indeed, there was a consultation 3 years ago, but no movement forward from that point. The government has now said that it will once again consult on changes, that's the Welsh Government, with Rebecca Evans, Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, Energy and Planning, confirming in a letter to the Chair of the Petitions Committee that the Welsh Government is progressing work on this. She said they would be issuing the consultation paper on this and other changes to permitted development rights later, adding the proposed subordinate legislation will be subject to scrutiny by the Senedd, so taking account of these consultation processes, the start of the summer camping season 2025 will be the earliest any possible changes can be put into place. Now, Dan Yates, who's a founder of pitchup.com, has campaigned on this issue. He said that the move would have a hugely positive impact on Wales's rural economy, stating, quote, a permanent extension to 60 days was enacted in England quickly, but the Welsh Government remained very tight-lipped on the outcome of their consultation. They also resisted pressure from farmers and landowners, believing the discrepancy in regulations to be unfair to follow. But at long last, this later development does seem to offer some hope to Wales's agritourism sector. We're delighted to learn that the Welsh Government is working towards a workable solution. And on that note, that's it for this edition of the podcast. You can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 1, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Bye now.
Thank you for listening.